Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning on. It's been going pretty good and we're slowly rising too in our numbers of viewers. But anyways, today we have Dave Hopper. He is one of our very own Bradley County Master Gardeners. Dave, how long have you been in the group?
I joined the Master Gardeners in 2012 was my class.
Daggum. So he's been in this group for a good minute and he's really contributed a lot for everybody, and he's very knowledgeable on composting and vermicomposting. Claims it's a hobby and just a hobby, but I feel like what does Linda say? He knows enough to be dangerous. So I'm pretty excited to have him on today. So thank you very much, Dave, for taking the time to join me.
Okay, thank you, Evangeline. Thank you, Tom, for asking me to do this. When Evangeline first asked me to do this, she wanted me to do a presentation about composting with worms. And at first, I was not sure how to do a composting with worms without basically somewhat talking about some composting in general, because they kind of go hand in hand. You got to know a little bit about basic composting before you start composting with worms. We're going to talk today a little bit about composting in general. And then the last few slides I have are about worm composting. That's probably where most of the interest is today. I don't know what the nature of the viewers are today, how many people know what about composting. So we're just going to go over some basic information about greens and browns, materials required for compost bins and worm bins particularly. Composting bins are basically a larger version of the worm bins, and worm bins are basically for the house or the kitchen environment or work garage or work rooms. Or we'll talk a little bit about the worm type for vermiculture that's used for worm composting. And we'll start mainly with the browns and green ingredients and the parts, 2 to 3 parts to 1 part, or the 30 to 1 ratio. Master Gardener class teaches 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, and you first hear that number, you get a little bit confused how to apply that in the day-to-day activity of composting and vermicomposting. The composting basically needs oxygen, so does the vermicomposting. It needs moisture, so does the vermicomposting, and a volume of materials. All these ingredients are needed for both types of composting. The biggest difference that I've noticed through my time of playing with a compost bin is the worms that have a lot smaller mouths, so then the pieces really need to be a lot smaller for the vermicomposting to be successful. Let's see, moisture content. The moisture content has to be maybe 60%. We don't have a way to measure the moisture content, but we can do it with our hands and our eyes to see that the moisture content is like the moisture of a wrung out sponge, so to speak. Browns and green ingredients are important. We'll talk about browns a little bit first. Dry sticks are good, and dry leaves and newspaper. They'll talk about newspaper quite often in this presentation, but I like to use shredded paper as well, shredded newspaper as well, and shredded leaves. Shredded leaves are probably my favorite item if they're available. If you have them stocked, shredded leaves work really great. Sticks, I would probably leave out of the vermicomposting bin. Not that they would be bad, but the worms may have a little problem eating sticks, as you can imagine. At the bottom of this slide, I think it talks about the ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio being 30 to 1. I think a lot of the websites you'll look at online, and the Master Gardeners teaches 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio is the chemical balance for the carbon to nitrogen. That's the optimum for the microorganisms to do their job in composting. And C is the carbon, and N is the nitrogen. The protein source is for the microorganisms is the nitrogen, and for the energy is the carbon. And that's probably chemically determined through labs for the balance of 30 to 1. The only reason we talk about 30 to 1 because that is the true balance point. But for practical purposes, 30 to 1 is kind of going to be hard to achieve for a normal composter unless you do the math and do the volumes and do the carbon to nitrogen ratios of each material that you're putting in the compost. You're not going to hit this 30 to 1 other than by guesswork. And that's basically where we're at in this presentation. Let's see, next slide is about grass clippings. Grass clippings are great. They're fresh, they're green, and I wondered, I've done some composting with aged zoysia grass clippings. And over time, the zoysia grass clippings turn turn quite brown. And at the time, I thought they were still green, but I think over time I've determined, and I asked the question on one of the other Zoom presentations that was on the internet about the grass clippings going from greens to browns. And as they age, and evidently the nitrogen is not fixed in the greens for that length of time. If the green grass clippings turn brown over time, they do go to a brown. Now, what level of brown they go to, I'm not sure. Shrubbery clippings, fresh plant parts, kitchen vegetables and scraps, kitchen fruits and vegetables are basically, that's the items that you're going to be concerned with in vermicomposting. Mainly, anything that's fresh here, typically, and in these kids is holding these items, you see most of them are all green except the corn cob. Now, I got curious about the corn, so I started Googling that just a little bit, but the corn itself is carbon. It's a brown. But the husk of the corn are greens, and the corn stalks are brown. So I got a little bit confused with why they put the corn cob in this slide, which this is not my slide. It comes from another presentation that I had. But anyway, just a little information about the corn cob that's in this slide. It's a brown ingredient, and I'm not sure how high the carbon and nitrogen ratio is in the corn cob, but it's probably greater than 30 to 1. This slide here gets back to the point of the carbon to nitrogen ratio 30 to 1. Well, I put all these question marks out there because that's the guess factor in this. And the blend, it said at the last line, it said the blend may have to be adjusted. I'd say the blend will have to be adjusted as the compost develops, because you really won't know how successful your compost bin is other than trial and error. And because some ingredients have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, some of them are low. So getting the guess to 30 to 1 is kind of a difficult thing to hit that number. So the fundamental blend is 2 parts brown to 1 part green. And that's probably a great starting point for anybody that's going to start composting or vermicomposting. I have a slide coming up here in a minute. We'll talk a little bit more about browns to greens. I saw on one website where the recommendation was 2 parts green to 1 part brown. And that got me thinking, why would they do that? And we'll see. I think it's this next slide. Yeah, this slide here talks quite a bit about that. If you look at the description of the browns and greens, you see on the brown side on the left, the sawdust has 500 to 1 carbon nitrogen ratio. If you mix 2 parts of that to 1 part green, I think it'd still be too much brown. So aged chicken manure is the most nitrogen on the list that we have on the right side. My idea is if you're going to use sawdust to compost something with high carbon nitrogen ratio of sawdust, you'd have to use a lot more greens than you would browns. Most things would not be that way. Cardboard is another example. You see how the carbon to nitrogen ratio is very high on cardboard as well. That's one of the examples, or 2 of the examples, I think, where the nitrogen, you'd have to add more greens than you would browns to compost. Composting the sawdust would be great if it's spread within the bin. And I use it in the worm bins if I happen to have some sawdust from, well, you got to watch where the sawdust comes from too, by the way. You don't want to use it from treated wood or maybe walnut. Some walnut has a chemical in it that's probably not conducive for worms or composting. I did not put leaves on this list, and I need to probably modify that list. Leaves are my favorite item. I think there's somewhere around 70 to 1, something like that. Now, green leaves, if leaves are actually green, they will have probably a carbon nitrogen ratio somewhere around 40 to 1. But as they turn browner, the more brown the leaves get, I guess the nitrogen is not fixed in the leaves for that long, so they start going higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. Leaves, another thing about leaves, it's recommended not to use a waxy leaf like holly leaves, magnolia leaves, anything that has a high wax composition. They will break down, but it takes a lot longer to break down than it does normal leaves. Well, I say normal leaves, other hardwood type leaves or fruit tree leaves. Composting with oxygen is desirable. Without oxygen is anaerobic, and that's basically rotting compost. We don't want to have anything rotting in our compost bin. And let's just talk about activators just for a little bit. Activator is basically a nitrogen product that's used to add to the compost to get it started. If you have a good balance between greens and browns, you probably will not use an activator. And it's also recommended to use some topsoil or garden soil for the microorganisms that are in the soil itself to get a jump start on the composting. And I do the same thing with the vermicomposting bin. Use a garden soil, topsoil, or something with some grit in it. The worms like the grit in there, and as they digest the ingredients. It's less than 30 to 1, it's a green. It's greater than 31, it's considered a brown. Coffee grounds and tea grounds are great. Anytime I use coffee or tea grounds, I always squeeze out the moisture. Sometimes they have a little bit too much moisture, which is not good for vermicomposting. Basically, they can have too much moisture in the product. So you squeeze them out quite well, and you'll still have a good balance of carbon to nitrogen ratio without the moisture. Yeah, we're going to talk about vermicomposting now. This small bin these kids have there is similar to the one I built when I have a slide coming up or two of it in a few minutes. But they're convenient for storage, for one thing. You can have it, some people put them under the kitchen sinks. Under the kitchen sink's probably good. I'm not sure how much airflow you have under a kitchen sink, especially if it's in an enclosed counter. If you monitor it well and be sure that you got enough oxygen or air flowing through the holes in the bin, you'll see if it's going to be successful there or not. But the temperature environment is good there. Temperature, I will talk about that just a minute. I think it's like 55 to 80 degrees, 85 degrees, something of that nature. This slide says the main purpose is to get rid of food scraps. So it is a good purpose, but I basically did it to create worm castings, and in small amounts is probably the right number for me. I harvest my worm castings probably twice a year out of my small bin, and they're really dense. They're thick and they're dense, and I don't know how they analyze as far as the nutritional value for plants, but I know they're highly concentrated. This basic list talks about the worm basically that's used for worm composting. It's called a red wiggler. There's other names they use for that. I don't know if they're Latin, French, or some other name, but you read about them. The red wiggler is the type of worms used for composting. They're really small worms. I think the largest one's probably 1.5 to 2 inches long. They will migrate through the compost. They don't just tunnel. Some nightcrawler types of worms will tunnel through. They'll use the same tunnel back and forth. These red wigglers will go all over the place and consume everything that they can find. And they're the ones that you'll see that's recommended for composting. It says we'll recommend at least 1 pound. My compost bins are a lot smaller. It's about half the size. The one's listed here is 2 foot long. Mine's probably 18 inches long, about 10 inches wide, about 10 inches tall. And I started out with maybe 50 worms. A friend of mine gave them to me before he killed his worm bin by just feeding them coffee grounds. And I think he drowned them basically because that's all he put in his bin was coffee grounds. And anyway, I harvested like 50 worms from him, and I started out, and that's been about 8 years ago, I think. And so my bin is pretty satisfactory as far as the way it operates. I have a lid with small holes, which I'll show you a photograph in a few minutes, and convenient to the kitchen. I use mine in the basement or the garage, and it's under a workbench. I've got a shelf on the workbench. It's in the dark side. It's a dark place. And my bin's basically dark because the worms don't like light. Temperature range, 55 to 75 degrees is probably ideal. The worms will exist probably down below 40 degrees, even in the upper 30s if it's not that temperature for too long. Same way on the high end of the scale, they'll probably exist at 85 to 90 degrees if it's not too long and the moisture doesn't dry out. But the ideal range is 55 to 75 degrees is basically the ballpark range for worm composting. You want to keep your worm bin in a convenient place for feeding. If it's inconvenient, you're going to forget about it. That's the same way with the big compost bin. If they're inconvenient, you're going to get lazy. That's me. Well, you may not, but I did to use the composting to its maximum capacity. This is the basic instructions for creating your own worm bin. You can commercially buy different worm bin products online. But I basically started out with just small ones I found at maybe Walmart or one of the big box stores. And you just fill the bin with moist newspaper, preferably shredded newspaper or shredded paper. If you have a paper shredder at home, paper shredders work great. Shredded leaves work great. Shredded leaves, paper shredder, and newspaper, to me, are the best ingredients to build the worm bedding. They call it worm bedding, and you add the feed and add the worms slowly. Keep it moist. It says moist newspaper. We're back to the moist sponge concept. You squeeze the sponge out. That's about how damp the paper should be when you put your worms in. Here's the ingredients to add: the fruits, vegetables, eggshells. We'll talk about that in just in a few minutes. No meat, fish, bones, fats, oils, cooked food. Some cooked food you probably can put in. It's not been cooked in oil. It's no meat products. Like you were steaming vegetables for some reason and had leftover vegetables, you could probably do that. But the fresh stuff is probably the best. And depending on how large the worm bin is, what type you have, you can put the food in different places in each bin. I typically put mine just all on top. And that I'm going to try to do it go side to side because it may make it easier to harvest the worm castings when it comes time to harvest. It says add more newspaper, more moist newspaper every 2 days. That 2 days, I'm not sure about that. You'd add the newspaper, shredded paper. I like shredded paper. Every time I feed the worms anymore, I add shredded paper because I found out when I first started doing this, I didn't add enough browns, and it will get soupy and sticky if you don't. So you got to keep enough browns in the worm composting. If it's in the kitchen, you probably don't have a lot of browns in the kitchen. You got a lot of greens, no browns. So you're going to have to maintain the brown level to keep it somewhat not too wet and sticky. Citrus fruits and onions are not desirable. They're too acidic. There's too much acid in each of the product. And over time, if the worm compost bins gets too acidic, it can be harmful to the worms. I don't know. I think pH below like 5.5 or 5, I think it drops very low. It's not good for the worms. So just stay away from citrus fruit and onions. Eggshells. A lot of people like to cook eggshells, and eggshells are great in compost, but they won't break down very fast. If anybody's done any composting at all, when they get ready to use the compost, they'll probably see as many eggshells in it when they use it as they did when they put them in there. So the finer the better, especially in vermicomposting. If you have an old coffee grinder, a blade style grinder, you can dry the eggshells out, put them in the grinder, and it'll make powder out of them. Well, not powder, but like coarse ground salt. And that will be the best way to use the eggshells if you can do that. If you can't, put them in there anyway, because I found that when I harvested the worm composting, a lot of eggshells were still visible in the compost. But it'll add a lot of calcium to the final product. Maintaining the worm bin. To harvest the castings, push everything to one side of the bin, and when they finish eating that, put your new bedding into the other side of the bin. The worms will migrate to the fresh side once the old food is gone. And when they do that, you can harvest that side of the bin. If you have a problem harvesting the castings, shine a little light on top of the castings. The worms will go down into the bottom of the bin, so you can harvest the castings off the top of the compost, because the worms don't like the light, so they will do everything they can to avoid the light. I use the castings on house plants. I mix them in a ratio of maybe 1 handful to 4 handfuls of dirt. It just depends how you want to use that. Use on house plants, like I said, a mixture probably, I use a handful, just a handful around a potted plant. And it don't even have to be handfuls. And mix it into the soil. You make worm tea out of the leachate or the worm drippings. You can use that as plant food. This example, this is actually my worm bins. Went for a dark product. The dark keeps out the light, although mine is not stored outside. This is outside because I go outside to harvest the castings and clean out the bins when I harvest the castings. The lid has holes in it, and the first bin there, you said, see it has holes around the upper section. The lower bin is completely solid. This is a good example of the upper bin. It's full of holes on the, I say full of holes, it's got a lot of holes on the bottom and a lot of holes on the top of the bin as well, on the lid. And this didn't show the lid, but around the top edge of the lid. And when I first did mine, I think I had the holes a little bit too small. I went to like 1/8 inch or something. I was afraid all the worms were going to crawl out. Well, if you got a healthy bin, worms aren't going anywhere. So I'm probably going to open the holes up on mine to probably 1/4 inch, because you got to have good airflow through there. And I've probably only ever seen 1 or 2 worms out of this bin in 8 years. They'll all, sometimes they'll be on the lid and they'll be up in the upper section crawling around, but they will not leave the bin if the bin's healthy. That's the bottom line on that. You'll be surprised. I always thought they'd leave. If the bin's happy, they'll be happy. This is an example of the new bedding that I made probably from shredded paper, or topsoil, or earth, and a spray bottle is good for wetting the bin down with. Just a hand pump spray bottle with moisture. You can dump water in it, but spraying it, you can kind of go in stages to see how the moisture content is. And that bed in there may have a little bit of vegetables still in it. I'm not sure. I took that picture a few years ago, but that's a good example of what the wet worm bedding would look like using shredded paper. Again, you can use newspaper. You just rip it up small pieces. Newspaper works great, and shredded leaves works perfect. This slide shows worm castings probably when I was getting ready to harvest. You'll be surprised how heavy that bin gets over time. It doesn't look like there's a lot of castings in there, but they're really dense. They're not as light and fluffy. If you buy a bag of worm castings at a whole big box store or something, you'll find that they're kind of fluffy. These castings are pure. I mean, unless they still have some food value still left in it. You see some shredded paper shown in this slide. There'll be maybe a few pieces of eggshell in that. I'm not sure, but when you harvest the castings, you'll always find some worms in the casting. You'll have to hand pick them out. And harvesting is probably the nastiest part of the job because you do have to handle the castings. I mean, they're not bad. Everything smells just like natural earth if your worm bin has been healthy. This is a good slide of the castings. This slide shows some of the worm bin drippings that come through the bottom holes of the bin. You're probably going to always have a little moisture that comes through the holes, and I look at that, I'll say once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year. If it's this amount in here it shows now, I probably put a quart of water in there in that with it and just pour it on plants. If you see that this particular slide has a lot of little white specks in there, well, I looked at them real close. This is about 5 years ago, and they were all moving. And I was trying, what kind of critters are in my worm bin? But over time, I kind of can come to empirically determine they were fruit fly babies or larvae or some part of a fruit fly process. Because when I open the lid, I have a few fruit flies in the compost, and basically it probably came from bananas or some type of fruit product I put in. But whatever it was, they're not harmful, and they haven't come back since. I don't know. I just got a fruit fly infestation, I think. Just like I said, a quart of water or some amount of water mixed with that and pour it around to your plants. This slide basically talks about what we did earlier, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, keep the balance in the bin as close to it as you can. I did read one place online that I think they said the 40-to-1 ratio is great for the worms themselves, for reproduction. The worms will reproduce in the bin. I think they say every 6 weeks, 6 months. I'm not sure the turnover ratio of the worms, but they will reproduce in your bin. Like I said, they said the 40-to-1 ratio was better for reproduction of the worms. Now, I don't know that. I can't speak to that much other than that's an article I read probably out of one of the extension articles online. Maintain the temperature again and maintain the moisture content. Don't overfeed the worms. I don't know how many worms you have in the bin, but if you just pile up tons and tons of food, that's probably not going to be good because probably some of it may end up rotting before it gets consumed. If you guys can read this chart here, it tells you some problems you can have in the worm bins. The bin smells bad. You're either overfeeding, too much food, non-compostable present, food scraps exposed to air, bin too wet, not enough air. Bin attracts flies. Well, I've never had a fly problem. Well, mine's basically stored inside. So if you're inside, you probably won't have flies unless you're bringing them in to start with. You stay away from rotten food. Too much food, especially citrus. Don't feed your worm citrus products. Worms are dying. Bin's too wet. Bin too wet will kill worms. It has to be quite wet, but they will survive to some extent in a damp environment, but not too wet. Too dry is definitely not good. Extreme temperatures, extreme to me, it's probably below 40 degrees and above 85 degrees. But if they exist in those temperatures very long, that probably get them too. Just I'd say just stay between say 55 and 75 degrees if you can. Not enough airflow. Airflow is important. Like I said, I think I erred on the side of not putting enough holes or not large enough holes in mine. I was afraid the worms were going to escape, and the worms will not escape, crawling away. And if the worms are crawling away, you got to look above some of these other examples to why they may be crawling. If bed's drying out, use too much ventilation. I've never had a problem with the worm bin getting too dry. I guess you could if you, depending on where you had your worm bin stored, or what type you had, and how you were maintaining it. You can monitor that as well. Liquid collecting in the bottom. I always have a little liquid in the bottom of that's what the holes in the bottom are for. It'll let the drainage take place. And if you have way too much, your bin probably is too wet. Too much watery scraps, celery, lettuce, they have a lot of moisture. So again, when you add in products like lettuce, celery, something that has a lot of high moisture content, always add a handful of, I say shredded paper, whatever brown ingredient you choose to use. Be sure to keep the browns added when you add the greens. We've got a few internet links here. Basically, what I would recommend anybody do wants to look this stuff up, when you Google composting or vermicomposting, put .ext or edu on the end of your Google request. Other than that, you'll get a lot of .coms, and some of the .coms have good information on composting and vermicomposting, but the educational sites have great information. They can have a lot of scientific information if you want to dig out for more of the information, how the carbon and nitrogen ratios are determined and all this other stuff. But these particular ones, I think one of them, North Carolina State, Oregon State has a good one. I don't know, TAMU, I can't remember. That may be Texas A&M has a good one. University of Tennessee has a composting section, but I didn't see anything about vermicomposting on the UT side. But there's a lot of good information. You'll be overwhelmed with information about composting and vermicomposting. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments box, and we appreciate you participating today. Thank you.
Thanks so much for giving that great presentation. Just how many holes in the bottom, how many holes on the side?
I don't know about how many, a lot. The bottom is just basically for drainage. If it's holding too much moisture in the bin, I would just put more holes in the bottom where it would drain out. Like I said, the worm, occasionally you'll find the worm outside the bin, but the holes in the top is for airflow. I think the more the better, to tell you the truth. I'm getting ready to make mine 1/4 inch. I think mine are 3/16 now, and I just space them around the spacing, maybe 2 inches apart, 3 inches apart. It's one of those trial and error things, but too many holes, I think, is not going to harm it, to tell you the truth. Like I said, if the worms leave, they're not happy, and they're not happy because there's holes in the side. So that's about all I can say about that.
Have you tried any other types of bins?
No, there's a couple of master gardeners have got some of the commercial varieties that they're larger. I mean, I can't feed mine a lot every day, but if you have a larger volume and use a pound of worms, you can get into this a lot more in depth than I have. Not in depth, but larger quantity, I guess. But no, I haven't tried those, but the same principles will basically apply. You just have to monitor them more often, and just see how they're producing for you based on the instructions that come with those bins. There's a lot of commercial bins available, but like I said, I just built this one as a hobby to learn something about it, and that's basically where I'm at now.
You said you had that same bin for how many years? 8?
2013, I think. A friend of mine started this at work. We had a lot of coffee grounds, and he had huge bins. I say huge. They were maybe 15-gallon bins. They were throwing coffee grounds in it every day, and they probably weren't squeezing them out. He had worms in there, and next thing you know, it turned into a gooey mess. And it wasn't because of the carbon nitrogen ratio of the coffee. It was just because there's so much moisture in there. I think he drowned them all. And there was no air holes in it for no ventilation. We had tons of shredded paper, didn't use shredded paper. But back in the day, I didn't know that either. So, over time, you kind of learn some of this stuff.
Yeah, I was listening to someone, I don't know where I got it, but I always thought coffee grounds were more on the browns. What do you think? Do they have any nitrogen in it?
I thought it forever, but everywhere you read online, it'll say somewhere around like 25 to 1. I consider the green. That was one of the biggest earlier surprises. You think the color of it dictates. Well, generally you can go by that, but not always. Color coffee grounds, like I said, they're greens. They're greens everywhere I've read. Just put it that way. And I hadn't done a chemical analysis to prove it, but that's what the big boys say, so that's what I go with.
I've been talking to others about compost tea, and there's a great site, you may have found it already, or Evangelon. It's called the Garden Professors, and they'll get into topics like composting, for instance, and they've gone back and forth, and basically these guys are specialists. I think one guy's from Florida, the other guy's from Minnesota, the other one's from Wisconsin, a lady, and they're kind of like the Ghostbusters or the Truth Busters, Mythbusters, I guess, of different things. And they got into compost tea, and you got to be real careful about bacteria buildup, especially when you do that. Do you have any knowledge of that, or?
No, only thing I very seldom make compost tea. My big question was how do you know the strength of it? And evidently, it probably doesn't matter because it's organic in nature, and most of the organic compost you can't burn or kill plants with that. But as far as the harmful effects of it, no, I don't. I hadn't done any reading. I probably read across some articles about that, but how you read, what you read, and what you comprehend may be two different things. So.
Right. I guess I just want to. I think the way you were describing it is pretty safe with the worms, that little bit of drippings that come out of there. But I want to caution people not to buy into all the commercial hype out there as far as compost tea is concerned. I think there's a lot of businesses that are out there trying to make a buck on different compost tea, what do you call it, percolators and things.
Right.
But I don't think there's too much university evidence on that.
Out of my normal composter, I have not made the tea out of it. Matter of fact, I've got two tumblers now. One of them I looked at the other day. It's dry as a bone. I hadn't been keeping the moisture content like I should be. I've got a lot of good ingredients in it, but it's bone dry. So I'm going to leave to, matter of fact, I may work on that today. But in the summer, I kind of get lazy with that stuff. It gets too hot to play with it, so I don't do it. So, but I haven't made compost tea out of any of that stuff. But the worm drippings, I do. I just liquefy them rather than throwing them out. I pour some water in them and spread them around some plants. They will not go through a watering can because the watering can hole is too small. There'll be some particles in there that won't go through. So.
Another question here. It says, what happens to the bin if you go on vacation?
Oh gosh, nothing probably. And if you're going to go along for 6 months, you might have an issue. But if you're going 3 or 4 weeks, is great. You just feed them to one side. Be sure that it's a good place. I've not fed mine probably for a month by forgetting to go down there, and they will. If they don't have food, they will start consuming their own castings, and they say over time that will kill them. But I'd say if you take a vacation, you prep the bin with some fresh food and some fresh bedding. They'll eat the bedding. Just if nothing else, just put shredded paper in it. They will eat the shredded paper, and the carbon to nitrogen ratio may be off, but they'll have something to eat. And that's what this is about, feeding the worms. So I wouldn't worry about it if I was going on vacation. Just be sure they're fed before you leave. Well, it's a good thing to do at home. The size bin I use is great. You have to get your worms from somewhere. You can't just go out and dig them out of the yard. You have to get the worms, the red wigglers, from a source. If you get somebody to give you some that's got a bin like mine, you can get your worms from that and start small and just see. But it turns into something you've got to do, just like composting. After a while, it's fun, but then it turns into what you got to do. If you don't do it, your hobby's going to go away. You know how hobbies are, and it doesn't happen overnight. So I got into it, and I still enjoy it. Another thing I didn't say is my granddaughter. She's 10 now, but when she was about 6, she loved to come and play in the worms. She'd get the worms out and put them in her hand. You're getting kids a whole learning experience from the grandkids.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's fantastic.
How important is the temperature? Because if I don't want to keep that bin in my house and you keep it outside, what?
Outside, I'd be careful about going outside because sooner or later it's going to be out there in the dead of winter and you're not going to like that, or it's going to be out in the dead of summer and you're not going to like that. So
I figured.
It's not terribly important, but I'd keep it in a shaded environment if it was me.
What
about in a shed? Would a shed work?
Yeah, if you could maintain it in the shed and and I've got an outside shed, and the temperature in that shed in the summertime gets quite warm. Now, I wouldn't want to get above 80 degrees on a consistent basis, because the worm activity will slow down when it gets hot. And if it gets too hot, you may forget about it. If you forget about it, you know, they will die then more than likely. So I don't know. You could try it if you wanted to, but I would look for a better option if you had just a little bit more tame place that's closer to the house that you can kind of keep it in a shaded environment. You can try it. That's all I know to say. If you can make in the wintertime, the shed's going to get cold too. Unless it's heated, it's 20 degrees outside, it's going to get 20 degrees in that shed.
Well, I think that wraps up another great garden guest series, Lunch and Learn, I call it too. And we're so thankful again for Dave Hopper to give that talk. It's nice to have really good master gardeners step in and do a good job and a nice participation. So thanks everybody for tuning in.